Okay, let's start. Um, Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar for the new academic year by the Social Scientists Against the Hostile Environment. It's a pleasure. My name is Nando Sigona. I'm Professor of International Migration and Forced Displacement at the University of Birmingham and Director of the Institute for Research into International Migration and Superdiversity. Um, it's a pleasure to have you here and to be able to introduce and launch two books that have been produced and written by a member of the Social Scientists Against the Hostile Environment Collective. The first book is entitled Bordering Social Reproduction by Rachel Rosen and Eve Dickinson. It was published in April 2025 by Manchester University Press, and I think this is one of the first launch that Rachel and Eve have done, so it's a great honor for us. And the second book is by Gwyneth Lonergan and is entitled Border, Citizenship and Pregnancy. It's published by Bristol University Press, part of the Global Migration and Social Change book series. As a social scientist against the hostile environment, we have looked at it into a range of intersection between the migration governance and the hostile environment and how it affects different aspects of everyday life of migrant and society more broadly. But I think this is the first time that look into the shoes of motherhood, pregnancy, and parenthood with such sort of depth. It's also a pleasure here to have as a discussant Professor Umut Errol, who will be speaking after the two presentation by the authors of the book. And then we're gonna conclude with a question and answer session of about 20 minutes that will be led by Professor Anne Phoenix. So without any further ado, I'm happy to give the floor to Rachel and Eve.
Great, thank you very much. I'll just share our slides. Can you see that?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us here. We're really excited to be sharing the launch of our book with SSAHE. So our book has, like any project, has multiple origin stories. So one is that it emerges from our 6 years of ethnographic research with destitute children, young people, and parents who have no access to mainstream welfare benefits in the UK due to their immigration status, despite being some of the most destitute people in the UK. So they fall under the no recourse to public funds bureaucratic category, a cold category that masks a whole host of state violences and affects people who do not have permanent permission to stay in the country, as well as those who are undocumented. So another way of telling the origin story of our book is it lies with our separate and joint involvement with No Borders and migrant justice organizations. That's actually where we first met, was in the Northeast London Migrant Action, NAMA, and we began discussing a number of different questions. So what do racial states do when they are unwilling or unable to detain and deport those they've rendered undesirable or disposable? What happens when people who are denied the means of life nonetheless endeavor to make and sustain meaningful lives? And how do children in childhood fit into this picture? Because as we'll say more later, children in childhood are often kind of quite spectral in these discussions. So the book works through some of our responses that owe everything to the families that we have spoken with. Yet we recognize the kind of complexities of writing about people's lives, possibly or even likely seem alien to them. One-sidedness brings a particular and hopefully generative perspective, but it's certainly not the only perspective. Our responses are also kind of a way of speaking back or speaking with and back to the existing work on no recourse to public funds. So too often NRPF is treated as part of the UK's hostile environment agenda, first introduced in 2012. And we argue for a longer historical perspective to avoid the risks of presentism, which can both distort both understandings and actions against the challenges to NRPF. And we situate NRPF not just as a sort of policy in the policy terrain, but within broader structural forces, and specifically think about its articulations with racial capitalism, showing how it's both a symptom and a technology of the racial state. And drawing on the traditions of social reproduction approaches, we interrogate how the making of everyday life is scraped of value, as Gargi Bhattacharya puts it.
A central argument of the book is that racial states do not just use detention and deportation as part of their arsenal of making and legitimating borders, but that welfare bordering is part of a tripartite of cruel mechanisms of control, punishment, and exclusion. Yet welfare bordering largely operates and is endured in the shadows, less sensationalized and public than floating prisons, immigration raids, or slogans such as "Stop the Boats." Welfare bordering is the reference to state welfare policies, but also the myriad of institutions, discourses, and practices involved in constraining and contorting the labor of making lives. It is both symptomatic of the racial state, setting the limits of its marginal redistributive functions firmly within an ethno-national imaginary, and a technology involved in its dynamic production. If, in British mythology, the welfare state is deemed to represent and care for the nation, determining who qualifies for social support is precisely an act involved in its construction. Welfare bordering, such as the no recourse to public funds policy, is typically presented as a necessary and natural facet of national migration regimes. These policies, we're told, make sense, demarcating as they do boundaries of undeservingness that accord with nativist national imaginaries. Their basic premise, therefore, often goes unquestioned. Even those who advocate against them rarely call for their abolition. Our imaginaries of change are often also captured by the very logics of welfare bordering that we attempt to contest. The idea, for example, that Britain's welfare system is not for all. What is often contested is not so much the premise and violence of no recourse to public funds, but often only its application to specific groups who have mistakenly ended up in the camp of the undeserving. There is then a need for a shift, not just in immigration policy, but also in campaigning against welfare bordering. The bordering of life-making practices works over time, a slow grinding process where, in the case of our research, families from Britain's former colonies who live in the UK are made street homeless, forced to live in single rooms without heat or working plumbing, often dependent on the kindness of friends or strangers, or made vulnerable to hyper-exploitation. Forced to skip meals, punished for not having the right uniform at school, denied the right to graduate because of debts to the school, treated with contempt and suspicion, and so on. The bordering of social reproduction stretches from the body to the psychic, symbolic, and material, an existential exercise designed by the racial state to make life impossible. As Samantha, one of the mothers in our research, put it, it destroys you mentally. That's what no recourse to public funds does to people. You lose yourself, you lose your sense of identity. In our view, this is no accident. The no recourse to public funds policy is intentionally subjugating and punitive, most aptly understood as a policy of enforced destitution and debt imposed on racially marginalized post-colonial subjects.
The profound violence, exploitation, and inequity produced through the bordering of social reproduction that Eve has just spoken about really resonated with many of the ways that participants spoke about their lives. They highlighted the extensive and intensive labor this compelled to simply survive. We heard about efforts to manually drain sinks that could not drain, a sort of daily endeavor. We heard about efforts to weigh up the lasting impact of making requests on strangers and friends. Efforts to endure being rendered exploitable and vulnerable to abuse, and to ensure that, as one of our participants put it, you don't lose yourself to NRPF. Indeed, as Shireen Rai argues, the labor of life can deplete or exhaust rather than regenerate, an insight which refuses the dominant romanticization of family life and the depoliticizing force of ideas like resilience or survival. The denial of the means of life via no recourse to public funds is both deep and profound. Yet, as social reproduction theorists demonstrate, because life-making labor is necessary not simply for capital, but for families themselves or people themselves, So families with NRPF must continue to reproduce themselves, yet without access to infrastructures, resources, or wider state systems of support. So this is a really violent policy that both shunts the necessary labor of life outside the state, while keeping labor available when needed. Many of the mothers we spoke with worked in cleaning, cooking, and caring roles, often in highly exploitative, abusive, and unpaid context, while children undertook difficult labor in the home, at school, and negotiating state bureaucracies. But the more that we listened to families, the more we began to hear another story running in parallel to the violence of these racialized welfare borders. A demand from our participants not to define and reduce them to suffering, misery, and lack. Families insisted that their collective efforts of making and sustaining life are also simultaneously filled with reciprocity and love, the hard graft of nourishing hope, the use of weapons of the weak, things like time and persistence, which are not yet fully commodified, and efforts to not just sustain life or survive, but to make lives that are worth living. Abiola, for example, realizing very early in her time in the UK how much her son's citizenship application would cost, explained, she said, bit by bit, I opened a box, a shoebox. I made it into something like a safe, and I started dropping money inside that place. Everywhere I go, I take that box with me. Even if I was desperate, I didn't touch that money. This is the money that is going to save me out of this condition, because I was hoping this is where the future is lying. So in thinking with Abiola and our other participants, in the book, we offer the idea of weathering to keep alive this complex interplay between bordering that makes lives impossible and seeks to deny life itself, and the lives of people who refuse to accept such impossibilities. Weathering, in the way we develop it, we seek to draw attention to processes of wearing, withstanding, fortification, and toughening. And that allows for engagement with the creative, dynamic, and multifaceted ways in which our participants spoke about planning, calculating, strategizing, and navigating under conditions of extreme duress. Their world-making labor cannot end racialized border violences. So this isn't sort of soft peddling the violence of NRPF. And nor can it ensure that human needs are met, given the contexts. But it does indicate the limitations and indeed fragilities of welfare as a site of bordering and social reproduction as a terrain of contestation. So while the state may treat these families as disposable and seek to make their life impossible, their insistence on futures, on nurturing common cause, acts as a challenge to the attempted erasure and denial of NRPF, a form of resistance. And so Miriam, amongst other children, spoke about the ways in which her and her siblings were going to do all that they could to make their mother proud, because she struggled a lot for us, they recognized. 13-year-old Isaac explained that, quote, I came to the conclusion that when I'm older, I want to help people who are in a situation like my family, living in a hostel, really help with them. A refusal to accept any kind of erasure.
Something that had always struck us in this context was the figure of the child. So in policy, welfare contexts, and in families, children are often simultaneously the object of intervention, a potential means to access support, a route to settlement, and the silent subject of advocacy campaigns. Children were often spoken about, but rarely spoken to. Central to this project for us then was to engage children as interlocutors, to consider what they had to show us, what keen insights about the impacts of precarious migrancy they had to offer, in ways which both paralleled and were distinctive to those of their mothers. In the book, therefore, we highlight the complex ways in which children laboured under welfare bordering, contributing to maintaining the household, engaging in caring and reparative emotional work, and navigating bureaucracies, often finely attuned to their families' situations. For example, when commenting about the cost of school meals for children in the context of her mum saying she could not afford to pay for lunches, Miriam, one of our young interlocutors, did not mention the impact on herself or the other children, but that of adults and her mum specifically. She said, yes, I think most parents who are suffering and can't afford much should get free school meals because that would help, because they have to pay rent. First, they have to get the food, and then that's just too much. So I feel they should give some parents who are suffering, give their children free school meals. Similarly, Mobo, reflecting on his mother's experiences with social services, used the word disrespect over and over, commenting on the ways in which his mother was treated as though she was stupid and unknowing, but at the same time like she was suspicious or conniving because of stereotypes of what a needy person should look like. The entire experience of seeking support from the local authority due to their destitution was, in his words, deliberate, hurtful, and mean, and ultimately dehumanizing. Mobo articulated a form of advice to their social worker and others. He said, it's not, the family is this case number in this file that you've been assigned to. Those are actual lives. Those are actual people that do also have their own stressful journeys and their own stressful periods. While children's understandings of no recourse to public funds were often intuitive rather than technical, and therefore easily dismissed by adults, they were highly astute. 8-year-old Sam, for example, told us that NRPF was something to do with not being allowed to move houses, revealing his profound understanding of the ways in which NRPF controlled mobility. Family survival was narrated by many of our young interlocutors as a collective, albeit fragile, project of common cause. What does it tell us when states that purport to protect children above all else consign racially marginalized young people to a life of enforced destitution? That these children are both denied support in their own right, even if citizens, because they are children, and denied support along with their migrant mothers because of welfare bordering. This is what Isaac, one of our young participants, described as cheating you out of your own country.
So in the book, through offering the idea of weathering, we tried to move away from framings of destitute migrant families as simply victims, as they often appear in the advocacy and scholarship. Such framings, one of the things that they do is they often lead to moral arguments about children as particularly deserving because of their essentialized status as the sort of quintessential vulnerable subject. But as we show in the book, that neither reflects children's experiences nor their practices, and it runs the grave risk of rendering mothers as undeserving or even hyper-responsibilizing them for the family's predicament. We also show how moral arguments against welfare bordering, whether NRPF or other forms of welfare bordering, ideas which draw their force from these kinds of ideas of child exceptionalism or deservingness, they seem bound to fail, or at least do little more than reworking the contours bordering life-making. As we show in the book, welfare bordering both reproduces and reconfigures the neoliberal racial state, amplifying the notion that welfare is a national preoccupation, at the same time as regularly marking and enlarging those deemed to be outside of this national we. And indeed, I mean, we can see in some ways how NRPF is an experiment in the horrific, tested on groups of migrants, but we're seeing it increasingly widened to others. So the extended 10-year period to achieve indefinite leave to remain, which is imposed on destitute migrant families as they seek to regularize with NRPF. It's now being mooted for all immigrants in Labour's immigration white paper. And the Conservative Party has announced plans to ring-fence benefits for British citizens only. So in reflecting on these points and the kind of insights and experiences of our interlocutors, we ask ourselves, who is to be cut next from the means of life? What social relations are minimized or obscured by ethno-national imaginaries of welfare or social reproduction, whether these are social relations of class to sort of more traditional forms, or ideas around collective determination and common cause? And what do such erasures mean for efforts to articulate a politics of solidarity against racial capitalism? So we kind of pose at the end of the book and look forward to discussing with you further what sort of alternate futures we can imagine if we just jettison a framework of deservingness and exceptionalism altogether. And how can we continue to move towards a politics centered on life, on dignity and belonging against and beyond borders. Thanks very much, and we look forward to talking with you about this further.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Rachel and Eve. And now I'm happy to give the floor to Gwyneth Lonergan, that's presenting a book on border citizenship and pregnancy.
So thank you very much, Nando, and thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you to Umut for agreeing to be discussant today. So basically, this book has its origins in my long-standing interest in reproduction and reproductive justice, especially as it relates to migration and citizenship. But I think I first started having the idea for the research project that underpins this book many years ago when I read a BBC headline blaming migrants for overwhelming NHS maternity services. Sorry, I was having trouble with the PowerPoint slide. And then in the years afterwards, in the run-up to the 2014 Immigration Act, I first of all noticed quite a lot of anxiety about the idea that migrants were having too many babies, whatever that means, and also that so-called maternity tourism necessitated strict limitations on migrants' access to the NHS. And around that time, I was also doing my PhD research on migrant women's activism in Manchester and Sheffield, and I was meeting women who'd been directly affected by the non-mandatory visa checks introduced into NHS secondary care by New Labour. So I wanted to understand first how this proliferation of bordering processes into the spaces of everyday life, including the NHS, impacted migrants' experiences of pregnancy and childbirth. But beyond that, I also wanted to explore what these experiences could reveal about the relationship between citizenship, bordering processes, and reproduction at this juncture. And by this juncture, I mean specifically not only the proliferation and intensification of bordering processes, but also a resurgent far right with a specific focus on the supposed threat posed by migrant families, which Umut has written about, and also neoliberal restructuring and austerity and the withdrawal of state support for reproduction and the consequent reconfiguring of the model of the good mother as someone who can raise children independently. So for the project, I interviewed migrant mothers in Manchester, Leeds, and Kirklees, and also interviewed some NHS staff and people who worked in the third sector. All of the migrant mothers I interviewed had arrived in the UK around 2010 or afterwards, and also had arrived in the UK as teenagers or as adults. So none of them had grown up with the NHS, which was important. And I intentionally interviewed women from a wide range of backgrounds and different so-called immigration categories, including people seeking asylum, refugees, women on different kinds of spousal, student, or work visas, and pre-Brexit EU migrants, because I was really interested in understanding how a wide variety of factors, including visa statuses, interacted in shaping migrant women's experiences of pregnancy and maternity care. And all the research, however, was conducted during the COVID pandemic. So all the interviews had to be conducted online over the phone. And this did affect the research, and I'm happy to discuss that in the questions if people are interested about that. Also, before continuing, I wanted to have a quick note about terminology, because in discourses around who should be reproducing the nation state, as well as in the policy papers I analyzed, it's generally cisgender women who are constructed as responsible for this. And almost everyone I interviewed, as far as they disclosed to me, was a cisgender woman. But it's important to note that pregnant trans men or non-binary pregnant migrants would face many of the challenges I'm discussing today. In addition, would be dealing with the interacting challenge of transphobia. And I'd be really interested in finding out more about that in the future. So two of the key frameworks I used in exploring and analyzing the experiences of my participants were that of reproductive justice and stratified reproduction. Reproductive justice is defined by the US-based Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective Sister Song as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have into safe and sustainable communities. It was a framework first developed by African American feminists in their analysis of and response to struggles around reproductive health in the United States, and in conversations with feminists and women's rights activists from the Global South at the 1996 UN Conference on Population and Development in Cairo. It is really important to know, though, that there is a long history of racially minoritized women in the United States, but also the UK and elsewhere, arguing for the importance of a broader and more critical view of reproductive choice. And effectively, reproductive justice problematizes liberal notions of choice by placing decisions around reproduction within the wider context in which they are made, a context in which intersecting systems of oppression shape the availability of resources for genuine autonomy, but also construct some individuals and groups as valued members of society and others as threatening, and also construct some individuals and groups as more entitled to bodily autonomy than others. I also use the concept of stratified reproduction, which was first developed by Shelley Colin, which provides a framework for analyzing how the state and other social institutions provide different levels of support for individual and collective reproductive tasks, reflecting wider patterns of social divisions and inequalities, including gender, race, and class. Now, obviously, there is a lot of overlap between these two concepts, but there are significant differences, and I found them both useful because of that. Reproductive justice involves a more radical structural critique that connects the uneven distribution of support for reproduction and bodily autonomy in general to wider discourses around identity and belonging and the reproductive future of a society. And that makes it very useful when conceptualizing the relationship between citizenship and reproduction. Reproductive stratification, on the other hand, provides a more granular analysis of how the differential distribution of resources is experienced materially in people's daily lives. And so it was useful for thinking about the lived experiences of my research participants. Foundational to the book is the idea that citizenship and reproduction are deeply intertwined and mutually constitutive. So I use Verbner and Yuval Davis's conceptualization of citizenship as hierarchical and multi-tiered, as creating a continuum of inclusion and exclusion along multiple axes depending on one's social location. And of course, British citizenship is racialized and gendered and informed by neoliberal restructuring in the sense that the ideal citizen is expected to be autonomous and economically productive. And of course, a central way in which citizenship is gendered is that it is women who are constructed as responsible for the reproduction of the nation state. And their reproductive activities are constructed on the one hand as a private matter, which women just do naturally, and so something for which they should not expect state support, but on the other hand is something that is critical to the future of the nation state and therefore a legitimate site of state intervention. And because citizenship is hierarchical and multi-tiered, some individuals, depending on their social location, are seen as more capable of reproducing the nation state than others. And policies around citizenship, especially social citizenship, differentially distribute state support for reproduction and reproductive autonomy accordingly. But at the same time, I think it's really important to recognize that not only do discourses and practices around reproduction, not only are these shaped by citizenship, but ideas and anxieties and practices around reproduction inform citizenship. They inform how individuals are located within citizenship. And I think we need to expand our definition of reproductive citizenship accordingly. Bordering processes, of course, select who can be a future member of the nation state and on what terms. And because of that, who will be responsible for reproducing the nation state in the future. And so unsurprisingly, there is a longstanding literature looking at how bordering processes are informed by anxieties around reproduction and also discipline who can access resources for safe and healthy pregnancy and new motherhood. But the present proliferation and intensification of bordering processes has significantly expanded the reach of the state when it comes to disciplining migrants' reproductive practices, which I will be discussing in more detail. So maternity care is one extremely visible site that is shaped by the relationship between citizenship and reproduction and anxieties around reproducing the nation state correctly. However, generally speaking, in the literature, when we talk about maternity care and its relationship to citizenship, it tends to be in terms of healthcare as a right of social citizenship. But I do think it's really important to take seriously the role of maternity care in the reproduction of society and think about how policies and practices around maternity care reflect who should be reproducing the nation state according to the government and what specific characteristics should be encouraged in mothers. So Better Births, the National Maternity Review for England, which sets out what pregnant mothers should expect and how they should behave, ideally, I would argue that it constructs an ideal birthing citizen, right? The person who should be reproducing the nation state. An aspect of this model seriously disadvantage pregnant migrants. So the ideal birthing citizen is supposed to be someone who is fully engaged with the NHS, in keeping with wider neoliberal discourses on citizenship, and is able to make good choices about her care, not only for the benefit of her baby and herself, but also to improve NHS services more broadly. So it's very responsibilizing, and there's a quote there from Better Birth illustrating that. As I'll discuss later, bordering processes significantly interfered with the ability of many of my participants to be fully engaged with NHS maternity services. But I want to first explore how other aspects of the ideal birthing citizen undermine the care provided to some of my participants. So first of all, one is racism, that the ideal birthing citizen of Better Births is white. There is an extensive literature on racism within maternity services. And we do know that between 2020 and 2022, Black women were 3 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women, and Asian women twice as likely. What Better Births, though, does is it reflects a white norm within maternity services. So when it discusses how midwives might support racially minoritized women, it does so under the heading of care for women with different backgrounds, which clearly constructs white women as like the default women and non-white women as different women, and ignore structural racism. The white norm in the training of midwives is also something that was raised by some of my participants who worked in the NHS. And some of the mothers I interviewed also reported racist experiences, like Asmani, whose doctor asked if she was crying because she had a daughter instead of a son. Language, I think, is also something that really reflects wider discourses around who should be reproducing the nation state. Many of the women that I interviewed with the support of an interpreter told me that their midwife or doctor either relied on family members to interpret or else used simplified language, neither of which is ideal, and both of which can lead to significant misunderstandings and undermine informed consent. And again, we don't see any real discussion of language barriers in Better Births. And while we can partly attribute this to, budget cuts within the NHS and midwives being very overworked, I think if we think about maternity care as involving the reproduction of the nation state, I would argue this reflects the way in which fluency in English is used, as Anne-Marie Fortier argues, to determine the so-called integratability of migrants, and the way in which discourses and processes around bordering construct migrant women who don't speak English fluently as threatening because they're unable to produce the next generation of British citizens. So consequently, the ideal birthing citizen is one who can already speak English, and extra steps should not be taken to support women who may struggle with that. Similarly, because the ideal birthing citizen is expected to be able to make good choices independently and to be British, it is often assumed that the ideal birthing citizen can navigate the NHS without any additional support. And this was raised as a problem by several of my participants who, because they'd not grown up with the NHS, were not familiar with NHS maternity services and didn't know what they could expect or ask for. And this is highlighted by the quote from Emily here, who critically was very well educated and fluent in English and still really struggled with understanding how the system worked. And I think this is further compounded in some cases by the fact that what is considered good maternity care often varies from country to country, and NHS staff are not necessarily explaining why the NHS does prefer certain methods, in particular the relative lack of medicalization of NHS maternity services. So as I previously mentioned, bordering processes did play a crucial role in stratifying access to maternity care and presenting obstacles to pregnant women and presenting obstacles to my participants when they try to engage with NHS services. And more broadly, through a reproductive justice lens, we can see how bordering processes serve to differentially distribute access to resources necessary for healthy pregnancy and parenthood, according to racialized and class discourses around citizenship and belonging, much of which Rachel and Eve have already discussed, so I'm going to skim through this part. But interestingly, the proliferation of bordering processes to new sites means that they're now being shaped to some degree by the sites at which they're located. And for maternity services in particular, this meant that discourses constructing pregnant migrants as especially threatening because of their perceived inability to reproduce the nation state sometimes came into tension with the professional and ethical commitments of NHS staff and the perception of pregnant migrants as an especially deserving population. Bordering processes currently bar underdocumented migrants from accessing NHS maternity services free of charge. They have to pay, although they can, if they choose, they can pay after they receive care rather than before they receive care. But the prospect of the debt and the potential implications for their immigration status is extremely stressful. And there's a significant body of research arguing that this serves to dissuade some pregnant migrants from seeking out maternity care with potentially devastating consequences. And this was echoed by some of my respondents, including Annie, who works in the third sector, and there's a quote here from her. Additionally, some of my participants were incorrectly told that they were not allowed to access NHS maternity care free of charge. And although they were able to sort this out, the process was quite bureaucratic and required a good grasp of English or else outside support, which further stratified access to maternity services. And you can see a quote from Azra here explaining the process she had to go through in order to confirm that she had access to free maternity care. The poverty produced by bordering processes can also make it difficult for women to attend their maternity appointments, whether it's insufficient asylum support or no recourse to public funds. In addition, the chaos and stress created by bordering processes may lead some women to deprioritize their care. And in addition, asylum-seeking women in particular might be dispersed. In theory, the government says they will not disperse anyone after 34 weeks of pregnancy. In practice, I heard from several people that it's actually quite common. And Sana, who's quoted here, was dispersed to a new city 6 days before she was due to give birth, which meant she did not know where the maternity hospital was. She didn't know any of the midwives, and her husband couldn't accompany her because he had to stay home with their other children because they didn't know anyone else who could watch their children. It's important to note that dispersal also disrupts continuity of care. The practice of having one midwife look after a woman for her entire pregnancy, which is generally considered the gold standard of care within the NHS. And it really points to the disposability and disrespect with which some pregnant migrants are treated. But interestingly, as mentioned, the co-optation of NHS maternity services into bordering processes sometimes had unintended consequences, because many of the midwives and other NHS staff I interviewed had very strong moral and professional objections to charging for maternity care and discussed how they would try to undermine it or subvert it in some way, or to encourage pregnant patients to attend their appointments no matter what. Some NHS staff also supported precarious migrants in negotiating the immigration system and dealing with other aspects of stratified reproduction by bordering processes. So you have Lisa here explaining how her midwife actually helped her access a home office grant for maternity. And then many of the women I interview had also come to the UK on spousal visas or as dependents on their husband's work or student visa. And so family bordering processes, which I define as the policies and processes which determine which migrants can live as a family in the UK and on what terms, these were also deeply informed by anxieties around reproduction because of the construction of the heteronormative nuclear family as the correct site for the reproduction of the nation state. And as Umut has pointed out in some of her research, the unfamilial migrant family is seen as threatening to the national reproductive future and has emerged as a key talking point of the resurgent far right, And we've also seen an increase in bordering processes targeting families in recent years, notably the recent government decision to suspend family reunification for refugees. So family bordering has also been particularly affected by the intensification of bordering processes. You can see above the different requirements associated with having a spousal visa and then progressing to indefinite leave to remain in 2007 versus 2025. It's much more expensive. It takes much longer. There are far more hoops to jump through. You're under government surveillance for much, much longer. And so even the more privileged migrants I interviewed discussed the extent to which even some of the more privileged migrants I interviewed discussed the extent to which bordering processes constrained their reproductive autonomy and forced them to plan their pregnancies around trying to make sure they met all the requirements of the visa process, and discussed the stress of carrying the weight of the uncertainty produced by bordering processes. You have a quote here from Ayatri discussing just that. Interestingly, Better Birth does assume that there will be a family available to support pregnant and migrants, and especially new mothers. And indeed, as the government has withdrawn state support for reproduction, family members, especially grandparents, have often stepped in to fill some of the gap. But of course, first of all, family bordering processes make it almost impossible to sponsor parents or grandparents to come to the UK. So that's not an option for many migrant women. And the visitor visa system discriminates very severely against people from the global south. And so we have a quote here from Lamis, who's from Syria, and her mother was not able to get a visa to come and support her during and after pregnancy. And I think what's really striking about this quote is that it's not just the lack of practical support, but also the emotional distress of being so far from your family at a time that is often one in which families are coming together to celebrate and offer intergenerational support. So just to wrap up, I would argue that reproductive justice for migrants is impossible in a world with bordering processes and the gendered and racialized exclusionary discourses that underpin them. Even the relatively privileged migrants I interviewed, people like myself, who are from wealthy countries, who are middle class, who spoke fluent English, discussed the way in which their reproductive choices and the support available to them was shaped by bordering processes. And for the more precarious migrants, as discussed above, these processes meant trying to survive pregnancy and childbirth and raise children in conditions that were really grossly inadequate. If some people are excluded from the national community, their reproductive practices will be considered threatening, and they will be denied the rights and resources they require for genuine reproductive autonomy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gwyneth, and for this presentation. And it's now a pleasure to give the floor to Umut Terrell, who's going to provide some thoughts about the two books. Umut, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Nando. Thank you very much, Gwyneth and Rachel and Eve. So it's really a pleasure to be here and really exciting and great to be celebrating both your books. I think they're both two really important books on social reproduction, mothering, migration, and bordering, lots of issues that I'm very interested in. So both of the books, I think, are really important interventions also into contemporary politics of migration and race. And they're challenging how welfare and health politics create stratified forms of citizenship for migrants, and also in the process create impossible conditions for social reproduction and doing family for some, notably families subjected to the NRPF policy in Rachel and Eve's book, and migrants with insecure migration status, asylum seekers and refugees who are birthing in Gwyneth's book. So I'll be repeating some of the points actually that you both talked about, because also Gwyneth's book does point out how migration status and considerations around work, income, residence, and etc., also shape the reproductive lives of migrants with more secure migration status. So, and in a similar, in a different vein, but pointing beyond the specific groups they're working with, also Rachel and Eve are careful to maintain a close eye on the specific racialized and migrantized conditions of experiences of reproduction, but they also point out how technologies of welfare bordering are often tested out on migrants with insecure status and can be extended to other marginalized groups who are constructed as abject. And I think this is something we're experiencing. The books are also part of a wider and longer trajectory of research into how racialized migrants and racialized groups do family. And this work has explored the restrictions and constraints that are imposed by migration regimes and racial capitalism on one hand, but on the other also have shown how family life, reproductive work, and care work can form important arenas for resisting racism and challenging what Rachel and Eve in their book call the devaluation of racialized migrant women's lives as useless. So in her 1980, I'm just going to bring up a few points that rather than any laying claim to any systematic review here, but I was thinking very much of the Hazel Carby's 1982 essay, White Woman Listen, where she critiqued white feminist analysis that posited the family and the home as the prime site of women's oppression. So Carby pointed out that for many Black women, family and home constitute places of reprieve from racism. And that's a point that was made also, of course, by Bell Hooks in her conception of home place, a concept that Rachel and Eve are using as an arena which may be infused with power relations, notably of gender and generation, but which can also become a space for constructing livable lives and livable selves beyond the violence of racialization. In migration studies, this point has also been taken up in various migrant, Black, and women of color feminist works that have challenged the ways in which the supposed oppression of migrant women by migrant men and families has been used to justify racist migration legislation. So one work I was thinking of is Encarnacion Gutierrez Rodriguez's book on migrant women as organic intellectuals in Germany from 2000, which has pointed out how the image of a pregnant migrant woman had become an icon in gendered racist representations, at once symbolizing migrant women as restricted to the reproductive sphere and incapable of social and political participation, and this as a consequence of this confinement to the pregnant body, let's say. At the same time, the image of the pregnant migrant woman also symbolized a threat to cultural and social cohesion of the nation. And this thesis, of course, is part of the far-right great replacement theory, which is also implicitly or explicitly a key part of more mainstream conservative, socially conservative, and right-wing discourses that underpin anti-migrant racist policies. It's a point, for example, that's been explicitly propagated in the book by a former social democrat in Germany, Thilo Sarrazin, in his book, Germany Abolishes Itself, where he argued that migrant women's birth rates were one of the key dangers to the nation. That was in the 2010s. So, and as Sarah Faris has shown in her work on family nationalism, this idea that migrant women are oppressed by their families and men has also been effectively used to justify racist and anti-migrant policies really across Europe. And she argues that at the same time, migrant women have been economically integrated as part of an underpaid and undervalued workforce in reproductive occupations. That's what Nergat and Molinari in the Swedish context identify as a form of gendered utilitarian racism. And in my own work, I've also pointed out this paradox where migrant women's paid reproductive labor is constitutive of social welfare, societal reproduction, and really social citizenship, while migrant women themselves are denied the resources to reproduce themselves and their families in dignity. And that's what Gwyneth identifies as racialized and migrantized reproductive injustice. In her study on Ireland, Ethne Levade has argued that rather than accepting this depolitization of reproductive work within the family, scholars should take heed of queer studies' impetus to view the building of undesired intimacies and caring relationships actually as a political intervention. And she argues that scholars should consider migrant women's unpaid care work as mothering against the state. And this argument, I'd say, draws on a long-standing trajectory of work also within Black feminism that views mothering and care work as connecting the care for children with the care for Black communities more widely. So Patricia Hill Collins's argument that Black women's mothering work is central to constituting and restituting Black children's and communities' sense of self-worth against their racist devaluation has inspired much of the work that's uncovered the social and political dimensions of mother work, both as care work but also as cultural work. So, for example, Tracy Reynolds' work on Black mothers in the UK has argued that a key aspect of Black women's subjectivity is the way they construct not only their care for their own children, but also their community work, including activism, as a form of other mothering, that is, caring, community building, and materially and effectively resourcing to resist racism. And one key aspect of this is challenging the derogatory images around Black mothering as deficitary and problematic. So one example of this is Anne Phoenix's work back in the early 90s with regard to young Black mothers, challenging this pathologizing discourses and policies on young Black mothers. So I think one thing that both books are doing is bringing together, on one hand, an analysis of the ways in which racialized and migrantized conditions shape the experiences of mothering and doing family, and critiquing these structures, but at the same time also exploring and valuing the ways in which the migrant mothers and children and birthing people develop their own strategies against the backdrop of often deeply hostile conditions. So Rachel and Eve's book suggests that the families develop a politics of hope, and that researchers need to acknowledge the important role this plays in families' lives, rather than reducing them and their families to a form of bare life, bereft of agency and political, social, and cultural capacities. Both books, as I said, I think are really important in the ways that they bring together an analysis and critique of policy, but all with foregrounding the experiences of the families, their subjectivities, and their narratives. And again, both of them are really beautifully written and pay attention to the political and social structures, but also the affective dimensions. So I'm very happy to be here and to be able to congratulate the authors. So I don't have a lot of questions, but I wanted to raise a few questions really that may be useful to discuss. And for me, it would be really interesting to think about how both books speak to each other, And one way is by looking at how concepts developed in one book speak to the other. So, for example, I was wondering how the concept of responsible reproductive citizenship that Gwyneth develops also speaks to the politics of no recourse to public funds. And on the other hand, how Gwyneth can see the idea of weathering racism that Rachel and Eve develop as something that that speaks to and maybe helps to capture experiences of birthing people, birthing migrants. And then to both sets of authors, my question is how you see possibilities for a politics of hope in the face of even more acute forms of nationalism and racism becoming mainstreamed. Yeah, so those would be my questions to you, and maybe questions we can also discuss with the audiences. But let me just really maybe start by congratulating the authors to these really important books, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Umut. I'm Anne Phoenix, and I'm just going to field the questions. I think that where you ended there is really important for congratulating these authors for books that I think will help to take forward our thinking on issues that, as you've made clear, Umut, that people have been struggling with for a long time, and which are recursive as and yet dynamic as the context shifts. So I think it would be really good to start with the questions that you've posed, please. So if I could ask Rachel and Eve, first of all, to address the links between the two books in terms of the conceptual issues that you've heard raised by Gwyneth, and what you think it means for the work that you've done, the research that you have produced over the 6 years of the ethnography and so on.
Oh, always awkward to do sort of co-presentation on Zoom. Eve, do you want me to go first? Yeah, okay. So first off, thank you so much, Umut, for the comments and the provocative questions. I really appreciate your insights. I think you know, your question about how this idea of the responsible reproductive citizen articulates with NRPF is really important. So I'm going to try this because I haven't read Gwyneth's book, so I'm expose my lack of of deep insights into what she's working through. But I think it offers us quite a bit in terms of thinking about families with no recourse to public funds. In some ways, we can see that families who are undocumented, whose lives are living in the shadows, are simply denied the possibility of being responsible reproductive citizens. They are abandoned in Ruthie Gilmore's kind of conceptualizations. So the sort of possibility doesn't quite even exist there. But we see maybe in some ways it offers some form of motherhood and reproductive citizenship offers a way that some of the mothers that we spoke with seek value for themselves in contexts where they're being told over and over again in forms that they are valueless. So this is anyone from kind of street level bureaucrats that are representing the state to wider public discourses and state policy, where they're being told and tell us that they feel valueless, right? Motherhood is a way of trying to seek value. So I think this is a bit different than what you're saying about the sort of responsible reproductive citizen, because this is in a way trying to an effort which we could read as an effort to claim value through motherhood. So I think it pushes back at responsibilization and yet takes up the charge of mother. Eve, do you want to add? Sorry.
No, Rachel, carry on.
I was just going to invite Eve to question that what I've just said or add to.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think a lot of the issues and experiences that you were talking about, Gwyneth, are also ones that were shared by our participants, and I think there's a lot of overlap. I think yeah, there's also some kind of interesting things that have come up in our research that Rachel and I are working on now around the kind of suspicion around life making itself that comes up in relation to the families that we work with. So this idea that them even reproducing their lives and the lives of their children becomes a suspicious activity in and of itself within this kind of ethno-nationalist context. So I think there could be some really interesting points of connection with your work in relation to that. But yeah, lots to think about, I think, from today. And thank you, Umut, for your thoughts. It was really great to hear them.
Thank you. And Gwyneth, could you come back on that and also Umut mentioned the issue of weathering, that concept, and if you could work that into your comment as well, in terms of what it means for from the perspective of your research.
I mean, so I confess, I also have not had a chance to read Rachel and Eve's book because preparing for the semester has been extremely hectic. But it's definitely very much on my list. And yeah, I would agree that there's lots of points of commonality. One thing I did not get a chance to say in the presentation, but which I hope I do make clear in the book, is that birthing people are located differently with regard to discourses around citizenship and reproduction, depending on their race, their class, and also their visa status. And it's sort of specifically people on work visas or spousal visas who are expected to demonstrate responsible reproductive citizenship. You can have children, but only if you can show that you can have them and raise them without support from the state. Because if you look at what people who are left destitute or underdocumented migrants or asylum seekers, it's very clear they're not supposed to be reproducing at all, right? There is like no conditionality there, because it's not just that they're not going to be offered direct state support. It's that they're often placed in conditions that are directly harmful to reproduction and to bodily autonomy. Again, I didn't have a chance to discuss this, but housing emerged as a really important issue for a lot of the more precarious migrants I interviewed, people who were either being at risk of homelessness because of NRPF or were in like grossly inadequate asylum housing that was just like really unacceptable for babies. So I think there's a lot of points of commonality there. And I think weathering is a really useful concept for capturing the experiences of birthing migrants, because as I said, one thing that struck me was even the women who were in fairly good situations, who had good jobs, their partners had good jobs, their immigration status was fairly stable, would talk about having to have, their immigration status is like this sort of Damocles hanging over them that you have to plan around, something you have to keep in the back of your mind. But certainly the stress experienced by, again, the more precarious migrants in particular. There was one woman I interviewed who her baby was born prematurely and was in intensive care. And it was during COVID, so she didn't want to take buses. So she had to take taxis, but she couldn't afford taxis because she was on asylum support. And so she was only going when she could. And then she was calling the hospital every day to check on her baby. And just like the way that would absolutely wear you down and have, very real physical harmful effects on you. I think it's a really good point. I also wanted to add that I really appreciated in your presentation the emphasis on the agency of the women and the hope and motherhood as a way of claiming value, which I think is really important. Again, I didn't have a chance to discuss it in my presentation, but the women I interviewed demonstrated like enormous resilience and resourcefulness, dealing with the situation they were facing. So you'd have women talking about how their midwife gave them leaflets in English. They didn't speak English, but they used their Google Translate on their phone to figure out what they were being told. you know, and a lot of them talked about how they would use technology to get around, to keep in touch with family and get support from family and get around the barriers posed by visa processes. And I think, you know, it's important to remember is at the end of the day, they are having babies in the UK. They are reproducing the next generation of British citizens, whether the government likes it or not. So yes, thank you very much, Umut, for your comments, and Rachel and Eve as well.
Okay, and I'm really pleased that you ended there, Gwyneth, because the final question that Umut put to you all three was about mainstreaming a politics of hope from the work that you've done. So you've talked about how the mothers that you interviewed keep hope in their lives through their own agency, drawing on concept of weathering and so on that you've just heard about tonight. I wonder, though, if you could all three think about, you know, from what you've done, from the important things that you've said, given the juncture that we're at the moment in the world, do you have any words to say about, you know, what you can say about mainstreaming a politics of hope, or is that just too impossible at the moment? Gwyneth, do you want to do it while you're on the screen big still, and then that leaves Eve and Rachel to come in afterwards?
I mean, I think, as I said, one thing that I think is also hopeful is how many ordinary people, again, specifically the midwives I interviewed, but then when I talk about this project with just like people I would meet, were really horrified at the idea of cutting off pregnant migrants from maternity care, and you know, thought this was way too far. Interestingly, I was discussing immigration politics with some of my students today, some of whom have been directly affected by it, and I think it's important to remember that the government is very hostile to immigrants, but I don't think it's clear that British people are as hostile as the government would like them to be. And I think especially when it's people you know, and it's your neighbors, and it's the women you're meeting, and like at the school gates or in mother and baby groups, I think, yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for resistance and solidarity there. And I do think, I guess also, I think it's a form of activism that has to be operating on multiple levels. I was, during this research and then afterwards, I met a lot of people who worked for the NHS, and a lot of them were talking about you know, how they would try to support especially marginalized pregnant migrants. And on the one hand, it was really inspiring and hopeful, but on the other hand, I also get depressed sometimes because it did feel a bit like shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic because of the hostile environment. And I think it's really important to remember that there are people, I guess, working on this from multiple angles, and there are the people who are doing what they can on the front lines, and there are also people taking a more radical perspective and no borders perspective, as Rachel and Eve mentioned at the beginning of their presentation. And yeah, and I just think I'm not sure how coherent this is, but I think it's really important not to cede one single inch, right? Just, we're absolutely, like, there should be no borders. Reproductive justice and bodily autonomy are human rights, and we should not concede one single inch on this.
Thank you, Gwyneth. And can I invite Eve and Rachel to equally say something on the politics of hope and mainstreaming the politics of hope? Thank you.
Yeah, I wish I had the answer. It's an important political question. And yeah, when Rachel and I launched the book recently, we also had some similar kinds of questions, but that feel a bit kind of beyond my reach really to give an answer to. But I would say that you know, personally, I really take inspiration from the people in the research that we've done. Their ability to continue to have that hope, to imagine these futures, and to persevere and pursue the lives that they are trying to reach here in the UK in the face of everything that's going on. I think it's very inspirational. Sometimes it's quite mind-blowing that people do continue in that way. Yeah, I wish I knew what it would take to make that a kind of a wider project where we could really mainstream that. But I think I'm not sure, if I'm honest with you, and trying to get there, but I don't know exactly how. But maybe Rachel has more answers than me.
That's some pressure. No, no, I don't. But I feel similar to Eve in the sense that I think there's so much hope to be taken from what we've learned from our participants. So when I think about the ways in which the state has rendered these families, abandoned them, rendered them kind of valueless, or tried to do that, the ways in which the state makes them, turns them into disposable. And I think Gwyneth said earlier, not even allowed the right or the possibility of giving birth. That for children, whether citizens or not, if they're subject to NRPF, just being denied the possibility of lives. And yet, that's not what we see in our research. So we see the violence of these policies of welfare partnering. We see that its weathering is also this creative practice. It's a practice of change, of nurturing, of these little moments in families of, you know, a 13-year-old cuddling their sibling as the family speaks with us, you know, the laughter in a moment of a game that's being played in the midst of such intense pressures. That to me reminds us that, reminds me that actually what am I doing feeling this? These families gaining, nurturing, are growing up, and that's a job for all of us. And I think there's a second thing which for me is thinking about how, I don't know if this mainstreams it, Anne, but it's a way of thinking about how. But I mean, I think our participants have shown us how this national we keeps getting made and remade, and the national we keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So this is a violent process. And at the same time, the more we recognize how this is made. So when a social worker says to a mother, what do you mean you're destitute? I can see you're selling braided bracelets on Facebook. I'm not going to support you. When we see that kind of act of violence, that rendering of someone just completely undeserving of any support, we see obviously profound inequity and injustice, but we also see the way the we is made. And I think the more we recognize that, the more we talk about that, the more we hope to remake, right? So if the world is made in particular ways, we know it's made, then we know that we can remake. So there's something about that, I think, that's always being challenged by these families. Denied, life is made impossible. That's what NRPF seeks to do. And these families say, we exist, we refuse to accept the impossible, and we continue. So to me, that is a call to hope, a clarion call.
Thank you very much. And in the chat, there is a question from Anna Zueva for Gwyneth, and Anna's had to go. So I'm just going to read her question, Gwyneth, because I think it's an important one. She says she was struck by Gwyneth's observation that women, and migrant women in particular, are simultaneously expected to be independently responsible for their mothering, and their mothering being a site of government regulative intervention. And she says she's coming from a management perspective, and this sounds like the treatment of employees by employers. Employees are supposed to be both independently responsible for their work and controlled by the managers. Women appear to be part of capitalist relations process. Reproduction is reproductive employment. And I'm wondering, she says, if this treatment will only intensify as the concern for low birth rates is rising and spreading around the world. Okay, would you like to comment on that, please, Gwyneth?
Yes, I mean, in terms of whether the treatment will only intensify, I think that's really interesting. I think we are, first of all, probably depends on which women, because as we've been pointing out, only certain women are seen as being able to have like the right babies and reproduce the nation state properly. So I would not necessarily be surprised if perhaps we see actually a bit of government reinvestment for social reproduction for some women, but a continuing withdrawal of investment for others who are seen as incapable of reproducing the nation state properly. And also, with growing authoritarianism, actually more and more direct intervention into women's reproductive practices. So we've seen Roe v. Wade being struck down in the United States, so that abortion is now up to states whether or not they make it legal. I would not be surprised if we see greater restrictions on things like abortion and contraception, especially for women seen as having like desirable babies. And of course, historically, in places where abortion and contraception were hard to access, at the same time as this was going on, there was often forced contraception and forced sterilization of racially minoritized women and other women. So I would also not be surprised if we see more direct state intervention to prevent some women from having babies, which is extremely depressing all around.
Thanks, Gwyneth. Now, Neera, Yuval Davis would like to ask a question or make a comment anyway. So, Neera, can I invite you to speak, please?
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to congratulate the authors of the two books. I haven't read them, but all the discussion today very much brought me back to many years in which my main preoccupation has been about gendering the nation. And I think Gwen points that the reproduction of the nation is the main question is which women rather than women is very much in line with a lot of the racialization processes that we see in other domains of both citizens and residents and laborers and others in the society. But of course, things remain the same, but they also change. And it is true that the pregnant migrant woman is a focus of a paradoxical, contradictory pressures on the one hand as the main threat, and on the other hand as the main illustration of what liberal democracy should be all about. And I think that this is some kind of a paradoxical point in which a lot of potential struggle and resistance can come about. But I think what we need also, though, to realize, and that relates mostly to the women in the book of Rachel and Eve, is the fact that we are not just talking about women or migrant and the nation. We are talking about the kind of contemporary politics of belonging in which so many migrants are in gray zones, whether they already crossed the borders with their bodies or not, they are excluded, and no recourse for state funds, of course, is a very high illustration of that. And this is, as you say, these women are and their children and all their community is seen as disposable. This is what I borrowed from Achilles Mbembe, necropolitics. I call it necro-racism. And in a way, it's almost the opposite from in genocide, the other is considered because of their identity. Then you need to get rid of them, and they are very demonic, and you have to focus on them. This one is the ultimate logic of exclusion, not by demonization, but by ultimate indifference, because they don't matter, what Judith Butler called ungrievable death and ungrivable life. And I think if we talk about politics of belonging, I think the notion of weathering is so important, because we all know you need to, first of all, try and survive from one day and another. But the second thing is to keep the alternative narrative going. And this is why the conflicting paradoxical of the construction of the migrant woman as a focus of inclusion and the focus of exclusion is so important.
Thanks, Nira. And can I invite you to comment on this, please? I mean, I don't know if you want to go in any particular order. On my screen, you're Gwyneth, Rachel, and Eve, so you can go in that order if nobody wants to jump in first. Okay, Gwyneth.
Well, I'll be brief, but first of all, Nira, your work has been enormously influential for mine, as anyone who looks at the bibliography of this book will see. But yes, basically, I think your point about necro-racism and the politics of indifference is really valuable here. I wrote another paper based on this same research in which I looked in more detail at debates around maternity tourism in the 2014 Immigration Act. And one thing I found that was quite shocking to me, even as cynical as I thought I was already, is that the government had to, of course, run an equality impact assessment on the consequences of this. And in it, they acknowledge that probably pregnant migrants will be dissuaded from accessing NHS maternity care, and some of them might die. And then they say, but that's okay, because they're posing a serious economic threat to the NHS. But then in a separate document, looking at the same policy, they estimate the cost of pregnant undocumented migrants to the NHS to be less than 0.018% of the NHS budget. So they've effectively decided to let women die for the equivalent of the change you'd find under couch cushions with regard to the NHS budget. So I do think that's a really important point. And also, yes, that there's this paradox around pregnant migrants as both especially threatening and especially deserving, which was something that did emerge in my research, as I said, with midwives who just refused to go along with it, with the charging in a way that some of them believed in healthcare for everyone, but others were like, well, maybe you should charge some migrants from healthcare, but not pregnant migrants. That's different. So.
Thank you. And Rachel, anything to add?
Yeah, thanks, Nira. That's really helpful. I think this idea of gray zones is really important. And there's nowhere where it's more clear than actually with children in childhood. So if you think about those families that are subject to no recourse to public funds that are destitute that we were working with, many of the children were in fact British citizens. Many of the children had in fact been born in the UK or had come at a very, very young age, but were subjected, as Eve said in our presentation, they were treated as non-human because they were children, or non-beings as children because they were then subjected to their parents' immigration status. And so we have, on the one hand, a state that kind of purports to protect children, or even a kind of global discourse that protecting children comes first and foremost above all else. And then we have a set of policies that denies children in their own rights any form of social support or welfare, and denies them that because of their kind of subsumed under their parents' status. And yet a policy around migration and immigration that says some form of kind of racist articulation of welfare as being for us or for the British people. And yet these children are quite often the British citizens, but are denied. So I think there's a really important, clear contradiction that also comes through when we think about children and childhood. I wanted to say something about indifference and necro-racism. I think that's really an important, helpful articulation, and the kind of ideas around abandonment did resonate with a lot of our work. We also, though, found that in some cases there was this indifference, and in other times, even the policy itself is an act of punishment. There is a very explicitly punitive element rather than indifference. So indifference is kind of the the outcome of a big recognition, a big acknowledgement, and a big and a significant way of trying to punish people for their existence. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. Eve.
Yeah, I was going to say what Rachel said actually, so it's kind of been said. But yeah, thank you for your words, Nira. And yeah, your work was really helpful for working on the book, and it's been very useful for us for a long time.
Okay, thank you all very much. Before I formally thank you, could you, because we're out of time, could you take the questions and comments that are in the chat, so that if there's anything you want to get back to people about, you can do, and that you at least know what people have said, please. So if the three of you could do that, that would be great. But can I thank our three speakers and Umut for the, wrapping up the raising of the questions and so on. And I encourage everybody to read these books. I'm sure that from what you've heard, you will want to read the books, because they throw so much light and raise so many issues of things that the social scientists against a hostile environment are centrally concerned with. So if we could all show your appreciation by either clapping visibly or sort of, putting up claps, that would be wonderful, because I think it's been a great session. And thank you all very much. Nira, could you remind me what the next SAHE session is, please? And if you know when it is.
I don't remember, but what I can tell you is that next Monday, as always, usually it's a week, but because this happened on Thursday rather than on Monday, that next feedback come planning meeting of SAHE is going to take place next Monday. So I'm going to circulate the Zoom link to all the SAHE members, but if any of you who attended this webinar would like to join us, please email me through my UEL email address, and I will add you to the list, and I will send you the Zoom link, and it's going to take place in this coming Monday at 5 o'clock on Zoom, and then we are going to finalize what the next webinar. I'm afraid my senior memory is not very good in that respect in terms of the thing, but I very much encourage you to join SAHE, because I think there's not been time like now in which we all can do it. And can I, in terms of another event, however, that I do remember and I do want to tell you about, is that SAHE is also associated with a global network of migrant scholars mobilizing resistance. And we have people working with us for more than 40 countries. And we decided in November 11, in the tradition, good old tradition of the anti-Vietnam War, to have a teach in, come teach out. And we are also organizing on November 11, there's going to be a teach in from 1 to 5 in Backpack Cinema. And this is mainly not for scholars or activists or even migrants, but for people who are really want to understand why are migrants treated in the way that has been described in this webinar, why the fuss about the hotels, what's the fuss about the boats, etc., etc. So please encourage your students, your community group, anybody who needs to discuss and think and find the answers in order to be able to join the resistance of what Nina Glick-Schiller, who initiated originally this network called the Global War Against Migrants, then that's what we're going to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nira. And thank you all for coming. And thanks again to Eve, Rachel, Gwyneth, and Umut for a wonderful session. I think that we're beyond our time. So thank you all very much.
And thanks, Anne and Nando, for chairing.
Yes, thank you so much for your chairing and everybody for their really interesting comments. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.